Good morning. Good morning and welcome. Today I'll be talking about the getting a little closer to that in the moment. What's going on and how do you arrest that pattern that starts off spirals, that pattern that leads to survival mode or catastrophization. So I talk a lot about prevention, and I almost make it sound like it's a black and white idea, but the point is there's correction, which is definitely correction, right? And that's I avoid that. I don't want to have to do anything that's corrective. I want everything to be on the preventive side. But if you think about it, it's like a continuum. Because if you have total correction on one side and total prevention on the other, on on the corrective side, we can see the challenge is just going to be it's just going to cost you money. You'll be spinning your wheels. But on the prevention side, if you go to the extreme, you do nothing. So it's more like a continuum, and where I want to spend my time is as close to that line as I can get to preventing it. So, I've heard examples about going upstream. There's alligators coming into the water, and the people are fighting off the alligators. And someone came in and decided to well, where the alligators coming from, and they decided to look into that. And people saying, "Where are you going? We need you. We need you to fight these alligators." But this person goes upstream to stop the alligators from coming into this area where people wanted to get in the water. It's just a quick story that kind of illustrates. And total prevention would be to not go in the water. But by going upstream a little bit, you have other choices and other options. And that's what we're talking about today. Now, on Friday, I drew this diagram where I talked about you have your step one. This is on the 7 step reset. And you have step two, and it's 7 steps. So I'm leaving steps 3 to 7 off the page. And there's two things we're going to introduce here. So on step one, the way I normally talk about it, we have beliefs, neuroplasticity, priming, mindset, and physiology. And that's P1. So all of these are important. And this is where I start. I want to make sure that we're in a good place with beliefs, neuroplasticity, priming, mindset, and physiology. And you could almost think of this as a coach working with a client as a dashboard, because I'm looking to see which one of these are the weak link, which one do we need to work on. And it's a constant process. That's why it's step one. We're always conditioning. And that's the name of this step is development and conditioning. So we want to condition these behaviors. And now on Friday, I introduced two development pieces. One is the positivity exercise or positivity skill. And there's actually a neuroscience terminology that gets to this, and it's called appraisal reclassification. So if you remember in the 7 phases of the 1 second habit model or the 1 second stimulus reaction model, you have pre listening and then you have initial detection. So this positivity exercise gets at the uh, detection reclassification or appraisal. I'm sorry, appraisal reclassification. So it's initial detection, rapid appraisal, and this hits at the rapid appraisal. And the other thing we talked about was emotion modulation. Now, often I talk about emotional modulation at step 5 because that's before you take action. So if you are going through the model, step 3 is the conditioned reaction, right? That's the stimulus conditioned reaction, and then the response. And we don't want the response to equal the reaction, and it more often equals the reaction when we're stressed. So we need to get back to a place of calm and presence before taking action. And so that's why I'll do the emotional modulation. Step 5, we bring it forward so that and do it then before we take action, because step 6 is action. So if you we talked about this positivity and emotional modulation as something you have to condition. You can't just, it's not intellectual, it's not insight, it's something you have to actually condition at the nervous system level, at the conditioning level. So you're inside that conditioned response or conditioned reaction, that 1 second model. And then what we have is stabilized performance. And you can think of this step 2. This is step 2. I talk about it as regulation. You want to regulated. You want to be regulated in that step 2. Now, here's the area that gets broken down. In one of my talks, I mentioned how when we are actually in that triggered response where we aren't even getting the conscious mind engaged, that we're just in that survival mode and scaling very quickly. This is what you see when somebody's triggered and they just keep ratcheting up and there's no rational conversation that's going to help. And I talk about you have to extend this step 2. So the one of the ways of getting back here is to not let yourself ever get to that place. And if you can keep from getting to that place where you're overly stressed, you're going to be ahead of the game. So this first one is external. So let me back up. This is stabilized. So call this the warm zone. Let me set this up a bit first. What I'm talking about here is, and you can look to your own experience. I always say, you can Google any of this, and it's all the research is all out there. It just lives in silos, so you don't really see it as I'm laying it out. But you know that when you're stressed, in general, your access to your capabilities is lower than when you're not stressed. So we this is that stabilized performance zone, and they call it a warm zone. This is so you the sympathetic nervous system, and I don't like using these neuroscience terms, but you know, sometimes you can't get away from it. The sympathetic nervous system is what's happening automatically. It's always going on, but it's also where your threat detection happens and your fight or flight happens. And we need it though because it's also where motivation happens, right? It's basically our way of living. And then you have your the hot zones are above. And as you come out of that warm zone into the hot zone, that's when your capabilities, you lose access to your full capabilities because your focus is narrowing down, you see fewer options. It's the whole stress response. And the I'm drawing it this way because we have external threats, environmental threats, things that you can see, touch, hear, that things that are actually happening to you, something that changed in the environment. And then we have internal load. And these are early, you can get these early. These are early signals that you can get. So if you think about this as like a KPI on a dashboard, and what you're doing is understanding, is this really an external threat or is it an internal load? Is it just something like self-induced pressure? And you know that because nothing has changed. You're 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 reacting inside to past emotions, past feelings, things that have come up or are coming up, and they're causing you to be more and more and more stressed. Well, that's going to impact your step three. We want to be in a regulated state at step two. And the way to get there is by paying attention to this. And you want to do it early on. So I have it between one and two because, again, we're looking at prevention. We don't want to be correcting it. This is that getting access to your best version of yourself. So the positivity exercise, appraisal reclassification, and the emotion modulation are both working to keep us in that stabilized performance. You can ask yourself questions to determine whether or not is this something that just happened? Is it something that changed outside? Is it a, a is it a body change, or is it a narrative change? Did something change? So right now in the U.S., it's like the zone is being flooded, and there's constant headlines, and most of those headlines are designed to induce fear. Whether they intentionally are setting the headlines up to do that, the point is that's what headlines. The news a news station is going to use headlines as a hook, and the headlines that work best are fear headlines. And if you consider that so much is being done by artificial intelligence now, artificial intelligence doesn't know to make something a threat headline. It just knows what works, and it knows how to put words together. And it's going to do more and more and more of those threat headlines. And it's self reinforcing because fear hooks work better than desire hooks. So with the constant threat coming in, it's important to be able to ask yourself, wait, did something actually change? Did my narrative actually change? And last week I talked about having a backdrop. I used the changing world order, and as a backup, I used demographics just to look at what's likely going to happen in the next 5 years, the next 10 years. And then when something comes in, did that really change that? Now, that doesn't mean there's not a threat out there. It doesn't mean that it's not a risk. It doesn't mean people aren't getting hurt. It doesn't mean people, what's there's some horrifying things going on. But it didn't happen to me. And there's 300 million people. And yes, it's happening to a lot. And that's never acceptable. But my point is, we're no good to anybody if we're running around in high stress zones. So this is a nice way of using that step two as a way to say, you know what, is this threat external or is this an internal load? Because once you have that internal load, I'll show it to you because we showed that last week. So here is let me back up here. Hold on a second. Here's the network of neurons side. Make sure yeah, here's the network of neurons side, and then here's the conscious mind side. And majority of the time, to really get change, especially when we're talking about stressors, is we've got to be working over here. And this is why we use the positivity exercise, because it impacts your it impacts your initial detection, and it impacts your rapid appraisal, and it's going to mean you have fewer of those hot threats that come in, or hot activations, I should say. And then on the right side, uh, this is where the emotion modulation could come in. We can make that a habit so it's happening automatically, even here, rather than waiting for step five. And the reason I wanted to come to these diagrams is because what we're talking about is the difference between this, where you have steps one and two and you're regulated in a regulated state, conditioned reaction happens, it hands off, and now you have a response. So remember, we don't want the reaction to equal the response. And then you have the steps four, five, six, and seven. Five being emotion modulation, six action, and then seven is your presence, return to presence. And this goes on thousands of times a day, right? And then what I'm describing here with this step two and the warm zone and the hot zones, or the hot activation, this is what's going, this is what you want to avoid, because once you are looking internal, this is how it looks from an internal load. There is no more external threat typically. Now if you're being attacked by an animal, yes, there will be a series of external threats because you have to keep fending the animal off. But generally speaking, when we're talking about business, we're talking about internal threats, internal load that's happening, and it's just causing us to cycle through. So it's like this reaction is about to finish, and then it passes it off, and it's a cue for the next reaction, and it's about to finish, and it's a cue for the next reaction, and the person just catastrophizes right in the spot without anything changing. So we need some questions, we need some strategies to make sure that we're not falling into that trap. And this is important because as you as you get closer to crossing, let's say we're crossing the river, as you get closer to crossing the river, your anxiety can go up. You can start having more stresses. You're concerned about this thing. You're thinking about it. These could be internal load, right? This could be internal load. It's nothing that changed about your assessment of the river. So you have to have ways of getting back there. And again, the positivity exercise is one way to do it. The emotional modulation is another way to do it. But this is where your breathing comes in. So if you think about, if you think about breathing as a tool to get back to being regulated, and visualization as a tool to get back to being regulated, and let's call it affirmations. So I would say of those three, affirmations probably are least effective because, not as a whole, if you have a great affirmation and it's the perfect context, affirmations will work fine. But there's so much coming at us that oftentimes the affirmations are not targeted enough and they're not specific enough, and then it brings up a response from the brain that's not true, and it has a sort of a reverse effect. Talking is not your solution when you're already feeling the stress. Visualization has some power or some effectiveness. Definitely when you're in the warm zone, you can use visualization to stay here. And as you're entering into the threat zones, you can use visualization to get back. But think of it like you have warm. First, you have flow, and then you have warm, and then you have hot. and then there's I'll come up with some names for after hot. So in flow, and we don't always want to be in flow, right? Flow is about performance, execution, having a task. But if I'm thinking, if I'm working through something that's a cognitive exercise, a mental exercise, maybe I don't need to be in flow. Maybe I just need to be regulated. But as we enter into this hot zone, it could be hot one, two, and three. And as it gets hotter and hotter, once you're up here or here, now we're triggered and we're catastrophizing. As we get into this, you can use visualization to come back. But once you're in it, breathing. Breathing is probably the number one tool you have at your disposal. I would say breathing, and you want to strengthen it, you can use anchors to the state. And what I mean by that, if you are regularly doing breathing exercises and you're getting into a calm, regulated state, that breathing can become an anchor to get to that state very quickly. It's almost it's back to a continuum. If I said doing nothing puts you in is a state, and then you have breathing exercises, and then you have meditation. But if you meditate enough, or if you meditate in such a way that you can get back to that, and they use the term bliss, but that's calm. I'll just call it calm. If you can get there often enough and you reduce your stresses, what's going to happen is your breathing is more likely to get you back here, and you won't have to. This is I should uh, phrase this right. I feel I am not a meditator naturally. I learned meditating in the martial arts, and it was a very arduous process. It was, back in the Shaolin monk type stuff, and it was just painful. It was not what I was trying to do as a teenager or even early 20s. And I did not stay with the meditation part of it. And I know people who have, and they've reaped the benefits. But I did meditate enough to get myself to where I can get back to this state of regulated quickly. And then what I do is I use breathing to get into that regulated state. And then I use breathing that state to anchor myself. So during the day, if anything happens, I just take in a deep breath, a long exhale, and through that exhaling, I return to that regulated state. All right, I'm going to cut it off here. Let me see if anything comes up. I'll do a ask me anything. I'm going to start closing these off before the half hour, and then doing an ask me anything. That way I'm paying more attention, because I think what's happening when I go a little bit long, I'm watching the clocks. I want to finish under an hour, and I may miss some people who chime in to come online. Okay, so we'll talk next time. We'll see you tomorrow uh, at 7 o'clock. We'll see you.